My name is Elena, and I'm 31. 5 years of my marriage to Andrew felt like something solid, reliable, almost predictable. I valued that predictability, it was where my sense of home lived. I didn't notice the moment when that stability turned into a decoration. It all began almost imperceptibly. Andrew became overly attentive, bringing me coffee, gently touching my shoulder, giving me little gifts for no reason. Everything looked sweet, even touching, but there was something unnatural behind that care. His gestures held not warmth, but a shadow, like a man trying to erase his own guilt with excessive kindness toward someone else. I felt it on my skin, even though I had no proof yet. One evening he came home late, and in his tired appearance there was something that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Fatigue doesn't smell like fear. He moved like a precisely tuned mechanism, trying not to reveal the trembling inside. I watched him and knew something between us had already changed, but I didn't yet understand the scale. The next day I picked up his phone only because he asked me to find a certain photo. I hadn't intended to look for anything, but the truth stepped toward me on its own. A notification appeared on the screen. A short phrase, casual in meaning but devastating in essence. It was written by another woman, and that was enough. I didn't need to open their messages. The content of that one text was enough to tear something deep inside me. I walked out onto the balcony, inhaled the cold air, and allowed myself a few seconds of complete silence. No tears, no hysteria, just a world shattered into pieces. And one perfectly clear thought that flashed through the ruins. If he crosses the line, why should I stand on the other side? It wasn't a cry of hurt. It was crystal, almost icy clarity. Revenge doesn't come immediately. It matures when a person sits in silence and listens to their own pain. I didn't say anything to Andrew. On the contrary, I became more restrained, calmer. There was a steadiness in my tone that unsettles more than shouting, as if I were no longer part of our marriage, but remained in it as an observer. It frightened him, though he couldn't understand why. A few days later, Ethan, a former classmate, messaged me. He showed an initiative he'd never shown before. He suggested meeting just to talk, as he put it, but I understood. There was more behind his words than the words themselves, and my answer wasn't dictated by chance, but by a decision. At the cafe I saw curiosity in his eyes, sincere, deep. He studied me carefully, as if trying to understand what was hidden behind my outer calm. He didn't need to ask anything. He read everything without words. His gaze wasn't an escape from reality, it was a doorway into it. What later happened between us didn't begin with passion. It began with the feeling that I was finally alive again. Not a betrayed woman, not a victim of circumstances, but a person still capable of choosing. I agreed to go to his place not for romance, not for the hope of love. It was an act of returning myself to myself. I remember every step on the way to his home. Each movement carried so much cold calm that I was almost afraid of it. But there was no fear, only determination. Ethan welcomed me without excessive preparations, without artificial gestures. His simplicity was unexpectedly comforting. I closed the door, and that was the moment the circle closed, the one opened by that message on Andrew's phone. I was the one who shortened the distance between us. Everything that happened afterward wasn't about cheating as revenge. It was about taking back control. My body became mine again, not something I was betrayed through, but something through which I could feel strength. It was a night of transformation, not degradation. A night in which I stopped being a page someone tore out and became the book I wrote myself. When morning touched the walls, I already knew I wouldn't go back. Home, yes. To Andrew, no, I was no longer the woman he had betrayed. When I returned to our apartment, I found Andrew in a state of tense anxiety. He watched my every movement, trying to understand where I had been. And in the moment I calmly took off my jacket, I realized that my silence had become a stronger blow to him than any words. Andrew tried to keep himself composed, but his nervousness was sharper than the smell of the coffee he was pointlessly making for the third time that morning. He thought I should say something, show an emotion, shout, cry, make a scene, any reaction that fit a scenario he understood. But I was no longer within the borders of his expectations. I moved carefully, quietly, as if measuring the space between us anew. Silence became my weapon, and he felt it. I noticed how he tensed when I lingered too long on a cup, on the window, on him. What struck him wasn't suspicion, it was fear. Fear that he no longer understood the person standing in front of him. And it was true. He no longer knew me. In the days that followed, I lived as if rediscovering my freedom. I no longer held onto the habits that once united us. I didn't wait for him to come home, didn't ask about his plans, didn't maintain our small family rituals. I moved along my own trajectories, and in those unpredictable routes, my new strength was born. Andrew nervously tried to restore the closeness we once had. He touched me when passing by, showed concern, searched for my eyes. But the harder he tried to bring me back, the clearer it became that he had lost access to me forever. He didn't understand the cause, but he felt the consequence. I didn't try to hide the changes within me. My gaze became more direct, my movements more precise, my steps more confident. It wasn't a game or a provocation. It was femininity awakened not by his betrayal, but by his underestimation. At some point I realized that my revenge wasn't about cheating on him in return. That had already happened, and it happened not for him, but for me. The real revenge was that he woke up every day next to a woman he no longer knew, who no longer belonged to this home. I watched him nervously check his phone, afraid to leave it on the table, deleting notifications, erasing search histories. His caution became excessive, almost sickly, as if he himself had begun to fear the very weapon he once used. My silence forced him to construct his own fears. Every evening he looked at me as if trying to guess, am I still with him, or already above him? And the longer I stayed silent, the more vivid the scenes he painted in his mind, scenes I neither confirmed nor denied. I didn't forbid him to be afraid. One night, when he fell asleep on the other side of the bed, too far from me and at the same time too close for someone who was no longer my husband, I lay there thinking only one thing. My plan must be clean, precise, entirely unemotional. Revenge born from pain is always hot. Revenge born from silence is cold. And cold is always more precise. I didn't want to destroy his life in a single blow. I wanted him to walk toward the very edge where I once stood, and feel the pain not of loss, but of realizing that no one is holding on to you anymore. This wasn't the finale. It was only the foundation. My war hadn't started yet, but I already knew what it would be. Not loud, not chaotic, but calculated, elegant, and inevitable. I wasn't going to break him all at once. I was going to dismantle, piece by piece, the parts of his world he believed unshakable. The first signal came one morning when I woke up before him, not because of anxiety but because of clarity. It was the moment when I felt a root taking shape inside me, a path I was meant to walk. Not chaos, not revenge born from pain, but strategy. Every step of it was as cold as the silence that filled our home after that night. I didn't want to destroy him at once. Sudden blows give a person the chance to gather themselves, but thin cracks, the ones that spread slowly beneath the surface, create the greatest destruction. I began with the most important thing, myself. My first step was invisible. I reclaimed my time. The time I had spent for years on his needs, his thoughts, his worries, his habits. I got out of bed and didn't make breakfast, didn't ask how he was doing. I simply went into the shower, closing the door behind me so quietly it felt like a new world was beginning there. Andrew noticed immediately. He looked at me as if trying to recognize the features of a familiar woman in the silhouette of a stranger. I felt his confusion even through the wall. It was just the first, barely perceptible blow, but it landed. The second step, distance. I began living the way I would if I weren't married. Not cheating on him a second time, not seeking out Ethan, not creating new variables in the equation. I simply crossed Andrew off the list of my centers. I made plans without him, and he noticed. When I returned home late, his posture always held something broken. Not anger, not jealousy, just fear. Fear that he no longer knew what role he had in my life. For the first time, he had to fight not a rival, but the emptiness in which he had disappeared. The third step, chaos in his confidence. I started working too much, looking too good, laughing too often. I wasn't just calm, I was alive. And that scared him more than my silence. He saw that my gaze no longer sought support in him. And then a thought was born in him, the most dangerous thought for someone in his position. Perhaps she doesn't need me anymore. I changed my style, not for him, not for Ethan, but to remind myself of the woman I once left in the shadows. I started running in the mornings, staying longer at the gym, meeting people I hadn't spoken to in years. My life stopped being an extension of his life. I reclaimed my space, and Andrew slowly, but inevitably, began losing control over the world he once believed was his. The fourth step: mirrors. I didn't bring up his betrayal, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. Instead, I created silence for him, a silence in which he heard the echo of his own actions. Nothing hurts as sharply as guilt returning through someone else's indifference. He tried to initiate intimacy, touched my hand, stopping my movement, said words meant to erase the distance, but I didn't give him certainty in my reactions. I was near, yet unreachable, like light visible from afar, but impossible to hold in your palm. I became the woman he was losing every day, millimeter by millimeter. The fifth step: unpredictability. I allowed myself to be light, but lightness was no longer available to him. His days became tense, his nights sleepless. He started staying later at work, not because he was busy, but because he didn't want to return to a space where he no longer knew the rules of the game. He waited for the moment when I would explode, when I would say the words he was preparing to hear. But I stayed silent, and with that silence, I fought this war in a way he never could, without noise, without emotion, without losses on my side. Andrew began making small mistakes, forgetting things, misplacing documents, nervously checking his phone. He lived in a tension that could consume any man except the one who once believed himself too confident to be touched by it. Every day he came home a little earlier. He stopped getting distracted by his phone, tried to be near me more often than before. And that urgency to restore something that was already gone looked almost tragic. I watched him the way a surgeon observes the healing of a wound, coldly, without emotion, but with a precise understanding that what happens inside is entirely different from what appears on the surface. I didn't rush anything. My strategy wasn't about speed. It was about inevitability. The first major crack appeared in his work. He had always been focused, confident, reliable, but now his mind was occupied with me, or rather, with the version of me he could no longer understand. He made mistakes where he had once been almost perfect. His colleagues began to notice, and I saw him return home with that particular silence in his eyes, the kind that appears in people who have felt their own weakness for the first time. The second blow hit his social circle. Friends who yesterday seemed like his support began to drift away. Not because of anything I didn't touch that. It was his own nervousness, his excessiveness, his constant attempts to prove he was in control that pushed people away. Conversations with him grew tense, empty. I watched him slowly lose his social equilibrium. The third crack: our bedroom. It wasn't the body or physical intimacy that became the problem, but the space between us. I lay quietly, taking up exactly as much space as a person who sleeps without fear. And he shifted restlessly through the night, trying to reach even 1 inch where he might feel that I was still with him. But I didn't move. And that stillness broke him more than any words could have. I wasn't cold on purpose. I had simply stopped being dependent. The fourth crack: uncertainty. Sometimes I came home late. Not often, not demonstratively, just rarely enough and naturally enough that he couldn't find a pattern in my actions. It was the art of giving no explanations. And every time I returned, he sat in the living room as if trying to gather clues that did not exist. He began to grow tired of his own thoughts. A person who believes they know everything suffers the most from the unknown. The fifth crack: fear of loss. I noticed his true weakness for the first time when he handed me a cup of coffee and let his gaze linger on my hand a little longer than usual. It wasn't a gesture of love or remorse. It was the gesture of someone afraid that something is about to slip from their grasp and they won't be able to pick it up again. There was something small and human in that movement, something I hadn't seen in him for years. He finally understood. He was losing me, not because I had taken revenge, not because someone else appeared in my life, but because I had stopped being the woman he could betray again. The sixth crack: mirrored fear. One morning he stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. His shoulders were tense, his gaze lost. It was the moment he started seeing himself not through my eyes, but through the absence of the gaze that once gave him meaning. He began to understand that I wasn't going to scream, demand explanations, or fight, because people fight for what they want to keep. and I was not planning to keep anything. My plan wasn't to destroy his life. I simply created the conditions in which he began destroying it himself. When a man loses the ground beneath his feet, he often throws himself toward a place where no path exists anymore. Andrew was heading precisely there. I saw it. I waited for it. When the cracks in his life became too deep, when every movement he made carried that nervous fragility known only to people who live in daily fear, I understood. It was time to finish what I had started. Revenge must not be a spark, but a sentence. Not an emotion, but a fact. I no longer thought about morality. I wasn't the one who destroyed it. He did the night he chose another woman. What I was doing now wasn't betrayal. It was consequence. Ethan didn't appear in my life by chance and not as a distraction. He was the one who gave me a sense of reality when my world collapsed. He was proof that I could still choose. And now he became part of something else, part of my point of no return. I texted him when Andrew was at work. A few calm words, no emotions, no hidden meanings. Just the fact of a meeting that had already been decided in my mind. I went to Ethan without hesitation, without doubt, without fear. This time there was no silence between us in which I tried to find myself. This time I knew who I was, and I knew why I was there. It wasn't an escape from pain, it was the culmination of my power over my own life. My choice, my control, my final step. I watched Ethan, the way he touched me, attentive, calm, without the slightest need to demand anything from me. He was the opposite of Andrew in every way, and that is precisely why this moment became the perfect, mathematically precise revenge. It wasn't about love, not about passion, not about romance. It was an event that put a full stop at the end of my marriage. An event that stripped Andrew of the right to explanations, to apologies, to a second chance. When I returned home, Andrew was sitting on the couch, hunched over, exhausted by his own imagination of what was happening. His eyes searched for anything, any sign that could save his world. I walked past him calmly. My scent, my silence, my gaze all spoke louder than any words ever could. In that moment he understood. Without confessions, without evidence, he saw in my composure the truth he had feared to hear. I no longer belonged to him, and someone else had touched a part of me he had destroyed with his own hands. It was a blow not to his pride but to his heart, the kind of blow after which men either fall or disappear. Andrew broke quietly, without shouting, without aggression. He simply let his shoulders drop the way people let go of the belief that something can still be fixed. I saw something in him extinguish forever. I didn't feel victory. I felt closure. Revenge didn't make me happy, but it made me free. That was enough. Andrew left our home 2 days later, without explanations, without suitcases, without hope. Just a shadow that understood it no longer had anyone to return to. I began life with a clean page, without him, without our past, and without a trace of regret.